What if food is no longer food, but a tool of power? Seeds have become patents. Hunger is a weapon, and every harvest is a subject of control. The Montanto Project is not science fiction, but a reality in which corporations control grain, farmers, countries, and you. They have rewritten nature. The question is, can you bring it back? Watch closely. Because in this story, the plate is the battlefield. The history of food control did not begin in the laboratories of the 21st century, but much earlier, in the offices of those who, in the middle of the last century, understood that if you control food, you control people. This idea, voiced by various politicians and strategists, became the foundation of the so-called Montanto Project, the code name for a global plan to concentrate control over food in the hands of transnational corporations. One of the key figures in this strategy was the American company Monsanto. Founded in 1902 as a manufacturer of saccharin, Monsanto remained an inconspicuous player in the chemical market for a long time. Everything changed after World War II, when it began supplying components for herbicides, including a substance known as Agent Orange, which was used by the United States in Vietnam. Even then, the company proved itself to be not just a commercial entity, but a tool closely linked to government and military interests. However, it was not chemicals that became a truly powerful lever of influence, but seeds. In the 1970s, Monsanto began investing in biotechnology. The goal was simple and ingenious: to create crops that were resistant to its own herbicides. This led to the first genetically modified varieties of soybeans and corn capable of surviving treatment with glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup. But all this would have been just part of agricultural technology if it weren't for one important step. The company patented these seeds. Until then, farmers had been saving part of their harvest for sowing the following season for thousands of years. It was an axiom of agriculture, a cycle passed down from generation to generation. However, with the advent of seed patents, a new era began. Farmers were now required to purchase new seeds every year and sign license agreements prohibiting reuse. Failure to comply with these conditions was considered a copyright infringement, allowing Monsanto to file lawsuits and seek compensation. And the company took full advantage of this right. A wave of lawsuits against farmers began in the United States, even if genetically modified plants appeared on their fields accidentally. For example, due to pollen transfer from neighboring plots. Monsanto monitored farmers with private detectives, inspections, and informants. It was not military terror, but legal and technological terror. Invisible but devastating. At the same time, Monsanto launched an aggressive campaign to buy up small seed companies. Within 2 decades, it had established near-monopoly control over the seed market in the United States and parts of Latin America, Asia, and Africa. By the early 2000s, more than 90% of all soybeans and about 80% of corn in the United States were grown from seeds controlled by Monsanto. The company actively promoted the idea that GMOs were the answer to global hunger. The main thesis was, to feed the growing population of the Earth, we need sustainable, high-yield crops. This rhetoric was used at all levels, from school textbooks to UN reports. Opponents were labeled obscurantists, pseudo-scientific alarmists, and enemies of progress. But behind this facade of rhetoric lay a disturbing reality. Independent studies that attempted to analyze the long-term health effects of GMOs disappeared from view. Scientists who dared to publish critical data lost funding or were attacked in the media. In some cases, papers were simply retracted under pressure from corporate lawyers. Agriculture was turning into a digital platform. To sow, you had to obtain a license, and to obtain a license, you had to submit to the terms and conditions of the corporation. Small farmers around the world began to disappear. They were driven out by agribusiness giants operating according to corporate standards, with complete dependence on patented seeds, herbicides, and algorithms. Thus was born a system in which food is not the result of nature and labor, but a product with a serial number. Seeds became a commodity to be leased, not owned. The idea of food independence disappeared. Instead, contracts, fines, yield monitoring systems, and DNA content controls appeared. Thus, Project Montanto is not just a story about biotechnology. It is a story about how private interests can take over a key resource of humanity: food. And this is only the beginning. There is more to come: genetic sterility, terminator seeds, digital plant passports, control through blockchain and AI. If seeds are life, then life has now become programmable, licensable, and controllable. In the next chapter, we will look at how technology has transformed the very concept of food, and why some scientists consider GMOs not to be progress, but a new weapon. Since the early 1990s, when GMOs began to be introduced on a large scale in the agricultural industry, the scientific community has been divided. Some saw new technologies as a path to food abundance and the ability to feed the planet's growing population. Others saw them as a dangerous experiment with unknown consequences. But one question remained outside the scope of most public discussions. Could GMOs be used as a tool of control, or even a weapon? At first glance, the idea seems paranoid. However, in the early 2000s, leaks, documents, and analytical articles began to appear, suggesting the possibility of creating so-called genetic bombs, products capable of selectively targeting certain population groups. The theory was that GM crops could be programmed to interact with a specific genotype. This opened up some pretty scary possibilities. Just imagine: the same batch of corn could be coded to have an effect that's harmless to some people, but toxic to others. Or the other way around. A product only works with a certain additive supplied by the same corporation. This turns food into a programmable vector of influence. Such theories were long considered marginal until evidence emerged that such experiments were indeed being conducted, albeit in closed military laboratories. One of the most discussed cases is linked to a program run by DARPA, the U.S. Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. According to leaked data, in the early 2000s, cultures were being developed that could alter insect behavior through neuropeptides embedded in plants. The official goal was to protect against pests. But what if such a system could also affect humans, especially considering that plant and animal DNA sometimes have similar signaling pathways? Critics argue that such research could lead to the creation of a silent weapon, a system where the population would be influenced through their everyday food. This would be enough to change public behavior, weaken immunity, or even manipulate reproductive function. Many countries have begun to sound the alarm. Russia, China, India, and a number of African countries have restricted or banned the import of certain types of GMO crops. Independent commissions have been set up to try to verify the impact of these products on health. Some of these reports have never been published. There are too many interests at stake in this area. One of the most alarming aspects is the effect of genetic invasion. Even if a farmer wants to grow only traditional varieties, pollen from modified plants can drift onto his land. After a few seasons, the natural varieties degenerate, and the farmer is forced to switch to GMO seeds simply because no others exist. This is a form of biological takeover that is impossible to defend against. There is also another level to the problem: global biobanks. A so-called seed ark has been built on the Svalbard archipelago, a seed bank that stores millions of crop samples from around the world. The official goal is to preserve biodiversity. But critics argue that if corporations and governments are simultaneously destroying natural varieties in the fields, but preserving them in underground storage facilities, the question arises, who is all this being stored for? And who holds the keys? Independent journalists such as Jeremy Scahill and William Engdahl have pointed out that the largest biobanks are funded by the same foundations that support genetic research and lobby for GMOs in third world countries. It is a closed system where information, power, and resources are concentrated in the same hands. At the same time, unusual epidemics are emerging around the world: allergies, infertility, and a sharp increase in autoimmune diseases. Scientists are trying to find correlations. Some studies point to a possible link with modified foods, but they quickly disappear from scientific journals. Some say it's a coincidence. Others say it's part of a bigger picture. This creates a paradox. Technology designed to save humanity could be turned against it. Not out of malice, but out of greed, control, and the desire to rule. If you control the seed, you control the field. If you control the food, you control the nation. And if you control who has the right to eat and who does not, you control the world. In the next chapter, we will take a closer look at how legal mechanisms have allowed corporations to not only own seeds, but to rewrite the very laws of life. For thousands of years, agriculture was based on a simple rule: sow, harvest, save some seeds for next year. This model was so natural that no one thought it could ever be destroyed. But that is exactly what happened when Monsanto introduced the practice of patenting genetically modified crops. In an instant, agriculture became a legal battleground, and farmers became targets of lawsuits. In the 1980s, the U.S. Supreme Court recognized for the first time that living organisms could be patented. This was the starting point for a legal revolution. Monsanto immediately got involved. Every new variety of soy, corn, cotton, or rapeseed developed by the company using GMOs was immediately patented. This meant that no one had the right to use the seeds without the permission of the copyright holder. The contracts signed by farmers were harsh. They had no right to save seeds for the next season, could not give them to others, and could not even analyze them. Some agreements prohibited farmers from criticizing the product in public. Control was total. Monsanto went even further. It created a monitoring department to keep tabs on farmers. Private detectives, drones, soil and plant analysis on other people's fields. All this became part of everyday life for farmers. In the United States, real blacklists appeared. Databases of those who violated the terms of their contracts. One of the most high-profile cases was the lawsuit against Canadian farmer Percy Schmeiser. His fields were contaminated with GMO rapeseed pollen from a neighboring plot. Monsanto sued him for illegally growing a patented variety. The court ruled that even if the seeds ended up on the field by accident, the harvest belonged to Monsanto. This set a legal precedent that destroyed the very concept of the right to natural sowing. The problem was exacerbated by the fact that companies like Monsanto were buying up small seed farms around the world. This allowed them not only to control the spread of GMOs, but also to gradually replace traditional varieties. In India, for example, the arrival of patented cotton varieties led to a wave of debt among farmers. Thousands of people who were unable to pay for seeds and pesticides committed suicide. Reports indicated tens of thousands of suicides directly linked to the loss of agricultural independence. In Latin American countries, farmers who opposed the contract model were deprived of subsidies and loans. They were forced to adopt package farming: seeds, fertilizers, herbicides, equipment, everything from one company, everything according to a single scheme. In this model, farmers ceased to be independent and became operators of a foreign system. Corporations claimed that farmers benefited from high yields, pest resistance, and stable supplies. But behind this lay another truth. Every link in the production process was tied to the manufacturer. It was like renting the right to sow. Some lawyers began to talk about a patent dictatorship. They compared the situation to software, where the buyer does not own the product but only leases the right to use it. Only in this case, the product was grain, the basis of human life. Governments tried to fight back. Some countries passed laws banning seed patents, but the pressure was strong. Where political tools didn't work, diplomacy, loans from international banks, and investment agreements tied to the use of GMO technology came into play. Agriculture became a global battleground. On one side were farmers, scientists, and environmentalists. On the other were transnational corporations, lobbyists, banks, and government officials. This was not just a conflict of interests. It was a struggle for the future of food. The Montanto Project was not limited to scientific research. It included the legal system, international law, financial instruments, and the media. Everything worked in sync, like a single mechanism. If a farmer tried to leave the system, he was destroyed. If a country resisted, it was pressured. If a scientist objected, he was discredited. All this for one purpose: to establish patents as a form of control, to make it impossible to return to the previous type of agriculture, to rewrite nature itself, to make life a commodity. In the next chapter, we will see how this mechanism destroyed not only farmers, but also natural biodiversity. If, at the beginning of the agricultural era, the farmer was the center of the food ecosystem, in the new system he became the executor of someone else's will. His role was not to create, but to follow instructions. And if they dared to deviate from the rules, the full force of the corporate machine came down on them. Lawyers, patents, contracts, fines, and courts. This was particularly evident in the United States, where the legal system allows private companies to file lawsuits based on intellectual property. Monsanto turned this into a weapon. Hundreds of lawsuits were filed against farmers accused of illegal use of patented seeds. Most of these cases were based on accidental contamination by GMO pollen, or the inability to prove genetic purity. Fear became the norm. Farmers did not know what exactly was growing in their fields, because it is impossible to completely isolate a crop in natural conditions. Wind, insects, water, all of these things carry pollen. This meant that if you lived near a GMO field, you were already at risk. Some began to destroy their crops just to avoid being accused. The courts did not side with the farmers. Precedents formed an ironclad logic. Patents are above nature. Even if a farmer did not want GMOs, even if he did not use them consciously, he could become a violator. This did not just change the economy, it changed ethics itself. Entire movements emerged. Free farmers, food without patents, save the seed. People organized marches, tried to initiate local laws banning GMOs, and set up independent laboratories. But the resources were unequal. One lawsuit could ruin a farm. One fine could lead to bankruptcy. In response, Monsanto launched a large-scale farmer education campaign. Training programs were created that said, GMOs are the future. Submit, and you will win. Bonuses were given for complying with the contract, and discounts for loyalty. Farmers were encouraged to become representatives of the corporation. Some agreed, but most understood that this was not a partnership, but dependence. The rural community was falling apart at the seams. An era of agrarian feudalism began, when the entire agricultural infrastructure was controlled by a few corporations. Shops, equipment, loans, logistics, and markets were all tied to those who produced the seeds. Any attempt to break out of the chain resulted in isolation. Many countries responded weakly to this situation. The reason was the influence of lobbyists. Dozens of former Monsanto employees held positions in relevant committees in the U.S. Congress. Laws were written to protect patent holders, not farmers. This was not a coincidence, but a strategy. The situation was similar in other countries. In South America, agricultural pressure measures were widely used. Subsidies were denied to those who did not use registered seeds. In Africa, farmers were lured with free starter packs and then forced to pay for each new harvest. This was not business. It was a system of dependent agriculture. It was at this point that people began to talk about the concept of food sovereignty. This concept was contrasted with food security. If security is simply the availability of food, then sovereignty is control over its production. Those who lost this control became subordinate. Corporations understood this perfectly well. That is why they did not just introduce new technologies, they changed the laws. Initiatives were launched to ban the exchange of seeds between farmers. People who had shared their harvests with each other for centuries suddenly became criminals. In some regions, raids began, during which unauthorized seeds were confiscated. This is not fiction. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is reality, confirmed by hundreds of testimonies, court decisions, and parliamentary investigations. Monsanto was not alone. It was joined by DuPont, Syngenta, and Bayer. They divided the world as in the era of colonialism. Only instead of territories, they divided seeds. This is how a new form of imperialism emerged: genetic imperialism. By controlling what could grow and who could sow, corporations gained power more effective than the army. They controlled the future. That is why dozens of activists around the world began to say, "This is not just agribusiness, this is biopolitics. This is a transformation of humanity in which the farmer is not a creator, but an operator." In the next chapter, we will examine how chemical components such as glyphosate became part of this system, and what role closed scientific research played in this. At the heart of the agricultural empire built by Monsanto lies not only genetics. The second key component is chemistry, and the central element of this chemistry is glyphosate, the active ingredient in the herbicide Roundup. This product was presented as safe for humans, animals, and the environment. But behind this image lay a history that corporations tried to silence by any means necessary. Glyphosate was developed in the 1970s and quickly became the market leader in herbicides. Its main property is to block an enzyme involved in plant growth. According to Monsanto, it was supposedly harmless to humans. But by the end of the 1990s, independent studies began to appear indicating that glyphosate could disrupt hormonal balance, cause changes in the intestinal microflora, and even provoke cancer. The problem was that official bodies, including the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, relied on data provided by Monsanto itself. Moreover, in many cases, the studies were conducted in laboratories funded by the corporation. This meant that control over the evidence base was in the same hands as control over the product. In 2015, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, part of the WHO, officially recognized glyphosate as a probable carcinogen. This caused a public outcry. Investigations began, and thousands of people, mostly farmers and workers who had come into contact with the product, filed lawsuits against Monsanto. Many of them claimed that they had been diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, a rare form of cancer linked to exposure to the herbicide. The courts began to hear the cases. Some juries ruled in favor of the victims, awarding millions of dollars in compensation. In one of the most high-profile cases, the company was ordered to pay more than $2 billion. This destroyed the reputation of the safe product. Monsanto, in turn, tried to defend itself. It claimed that the studies were inaccurate, biased, or incomplete. It used every tool at its disposal: legal pressure, PR campaigns, discrediting experts, and interference in educational programs. But the flood of revelations could not be stopped. Journalists gained access to internal company correspondence discussing ways to manipulate scientific publications. In one letter, an employee suggested, "Let's write the article ourselves, and then just find a professor who will sign it with his name." Such revelations came as a shock to the public. Mass protests began in Europe. In France, Germany, and Italy, farmers began to refuse to use Roundup. Some cities banned its use within populated areas. But in other parts of the world, especially in developing countries, glyphosate continued to be used on a massive scale. Where there were no independent laboratories, there was no control. The problem was exacerbated by the fact that many GMO crops were specifically bred for use with glyphosate. This meant that abandoning the herbicide meant abandoning the entire system. Farmers became hostages. Either you follow the rules or you lose your harvest. Some scientists claim that glyphosate penetrates the soil and remains there for many years, altering the microbiome. This could disrupt the ecosystem, destroying earthworms, bacteria, fungi, everything that makes soil alive. In the long term, this meant land degradation and lower yields. In one experiment, scientists found that mice given water with microdoses of glyphosate showed signs of infertility after 3 generations. This was not proof in court, but it caused alarm among environmentalists. Some began to talk about hidden damage, effects that are not immediately visible but become apparent years later. Glyphosate became a symbol of double standards. Rich countries discussed banning it, while poor countries increased imports. While some sought clean food, others could not afford it. This created a new type of inequality, a toxic one. Now, new substances are replacing glyphosate, ones that are even more powerful but less studied. This creates a vicious circle. The more resistance there is, the more perfect the system becomes. Corporations adapt, look for workarounds, and introduce alternative products. But the main question remains: how can a substance with so many questions be the basis of global agriculture? And if glyphosate is just the tip of the iceberg, what lies beneath the surface? In the next chapter, we will look at how documents, leaks, and investigations reveal a broader strategy. What if all this is not just an economic model, but a deliberate plan to centralize power through food? For decades, Monsanto refused to acknowledge the existence of any global plan to control agriculture. However, over time, documents, internal correspondence, testimonies from former employees, and investigations have begun to surface, painting an alarming picture. This picture has been unofficially dubbed Project Montanto, not as a specific operation, but as a collective strategy to implement a system of total control over food. One of the first warning signs was an investigation by French journalist Marie-Monique Robin. In her book Monsanto's World, she described how the company introduced its technologies to various countries using politics, diplomatic pressure, and media campaigns. Her conclusion: Monsanto never acted spontaneously. Every step was part of a strategy. Since then, there has been plenty of confirmation. Leaks have revealed that Monsanto had its own reputation response departments, whose tasks included tracking opposition scientists, influencing the editorial boards of scientific journals, and planting paid articles in the media. Lists of hostile experts who were being monitored were discovered. In the 2000s, information emerged about a secret meeting at the World Economic Forum in Davos, where the need for centralized control of food supplies was discussed. Among the participants were representatives of major agricultural corporations, government officials, and heads of international funds. According to the leak, a plan was discussed to transition to a global seed tracking system, a kind of seed passportization. Later, documents obtained by WikiLeaks included telegrams from American diplomats referring to the national interests of the United States in promoting GMOs in Europe and Asia. Monsanto was referred to in these telegrams as a key instrument of strategic influence. But leaks from insiders caused a particularly loud outcry. One of them, under the pseudonym Saturn, posted an archive of corporate presentations describing a strategy of genetic domination. It consisted of 3 phases. 1. Buying up local seed companies. 2. Introducing patented products with aggressive marketing. 3. Lobbying for laws prohibiting the use of unauthorized varieties. Each phase was accompanied by a detailed plan for PR support, legal pressure, and the creation of dependency through agricultural packages. At the same time, independent reports from environmental NGOs appeared. stating that the introduction of GMOs does not lead to a reduction in hunger, but to dependence on imports, the destruction of ecosystems, and the loss of food sovereignty. These reports hardly ever made it into the mainstream media. They were written by activists, farmers, and biologists who were threatened or denied access to grants. Another important element of the Montanto Project is the digitization of seed circulation. The development of blockchain systems began, allowing the origin of each grain to be traced. At first glance, this is a tool for transparency, but in reality, it turns farmers into participants in a closed network where every step is controlled. Without access to the system, it is impossible to sell the harvest. This is food biometrics. Patents have been filed for terminator seeds, crops that are unable to reproduce. These seeds have been genetically programmed to be sterile. The idea is to protect intellectual property. The reality is that it is impossible to preserve the harvest, creating complete dependence on the supplier. One of the most sinister aspects is related to experiments in third world countries. In a number of African countries, crops containing substances that suppress the reproductive capacity of insects have been tested. Some activists have claimed that humans may have been involved in these tests without their consent. There is no direct evidence, but indirect evidence continues to emerge. Economic instruments also played a role. International loans for agricultural development were often granted on condition that technologies approved by partners were introduced. In other words, they were effectively conditional on the use of GMOs. In this way, countries lost their right to choose. It became clear that the Montanto Project was not a theory, but a reality, taking the form of a multitude of individual initiatives, patents, laws, and technologies. It had no label, no flags, but it was changing the very fabric of global food policy. If in the past grain was a gift of nature, now it is the result of code, patents, and contracts. In the next chapter, we will see how this control began to be used as a geopolitical weapon, creating food shortages where there had previously been surpluses. Throughout history, hunger has been the most powerful lever of control. It has been used by empires, dictators, and corporations. Where armies failed, hunger rations and humanitarian missions arrived. But in the New World, where food has become a licensed commodity, hunger has become a tool of geopolitics and economics. It can be rationed, artificially induced, and eliminated, depending on the objectives. In the early 2000s, the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, noted that despite technological progress, the number of people going hungry in the world was not decreasing, and in some regions, it was increasing. The paradox is that enough food is produced to feed everyone. This raises the question, why do people continue to die of hunger? The answer lies partly in the supply system. In third world countries, farmers are increasingly forced to switch to export crops such as cocoa, coffee, and cotton. The reason is loans and technological assistance conditions. Their fields do not feed the local population, but work for the foreign market. At the same time, the domestic market becomes dependent on imports, often those that contain GMOs and are more expensive. Global corporations control not only seeds, but also logistics, storage, and processing. At any link in this chain, a disruption can be engineered. For example, fertilizer supplies can be temporarily halted, causing prices to rise and creating an artificial shortage. This is how crises are created. followed by new contracts, concessions, and political changes. There are dozens of such cases in Ethiopia, Mozambique, and Pakistan. After another flood or drought, aid arrives in the form of seeds, chemicals, loans, and contracts. 3 years later, there is complete dependence. Traditional varieties have disappeared, infrastructure has been rebuilt, and farmers cannot return to their former way of farming. Some researchers claim that in some cases, there have been precedents where transnational companies bought up crops in order to prevent them from being sold. The goal is to manipulate prices. This is not new. As early as the 19th century, British colonial administrations disposed of grain to suppress uprisings. Today, the methods are more subtle, but the logic remains the same. In Europe and the United States, scarcity works differently. Here, hunger is not literal, but hidden. It manifests itself in poorer food quality, a lack of choice, and the creation of an illusion of diversity. Most products are made from the same varieties of corn, wheat, and soy. Their genetic base is the same. If something happens to this base, humanity will be on the brink of disaster. Scientists warn that excessive seed standardization makes agriculture vulnerable. One virus can destroy an entire crop. But companies are not responding. They care about predictability, logistics, and profit. Biodiversity is an inconvenient factor. Sometimes, the term food weapon appears in reports from international organizations. It means the ability to use food as a means of pressure. For example, refusing to supply countries whose governments do not sign the necessary agreements, or introducing cheap GMO products to the market to destroy local producers. This is a form of war without bullets, and it is already underway. The case of Haiti is telling. After the earthquake in 2010, American aid included seeds from Monsanto, but local farmers refused to use them, calling them a Trojan horse. Protests began, seeds were burned, and calls were made to preserve traditional varieties. This was not just a fight for the harvest, it was a fight for independence. The situation in India is similar. Mass ruin of small farmers, inability to pay loans, destruction of seed diversity. More than 200,000 cases of farmer suicides in 20 years. The figures are so horrific that they have become taboo. In Latin America, entire regions are losing their food independence. Dependence on GMO grain treated with glyphosate has become so deep that even if they wanted to, it would be impossible to switch to natural farming without catastrophic crop losses. In effect, hunger is being privatized. Those who determine what is grown and where determine who will eat. Those who control the seeds control life. In this context, it becomes clear that the Montanto Project is not just an economic model. It is a new model of power. It is invisible, without an army or flags. But it works. Through grain, through contracts, through the fear of losing the harvest. In the next and final chapter, we will look at where all this is leading, what technologies are already being implemented, and whether humans will be able to break free from the chains of food slavery, or whether we are entering a new era of digital food, where every bite will be controlled. The future of food is no longer a matter of fantasy. It is programmed, developed in laboratories, and financed by major investment funds. When control over seeds reached its peak, the next step became obvious: the complete digitization of food. And this is the direction in which the world is moving. One of the most striking examples is CRISPR technology. It can be used to edit the genes of plants, animals, and, in theory, humans. These possibilities open up not just new varieties, but the opportunity to rewrite the very definition of food. Seeds that activate at a certain temperature. Fruits that change taste depending on storage conditions. Meat without animals. Milk without cows. Such a transformation seems like science fiction, but companies such as Bayer Monsanto, Syngenta, and Cargill are already investing in startups that are creating so-called smart products. Food is becoming a platform. Like a smartphone, it only works with certain software, additives, chemicals, infrastructure. At the same time, food passport systems are being introduced. These are digital profiles of products, from their genetic structure to their transport conditions. At first glance, this seems like progress, a fight against counterfeiting, and a way to ensure traceability. But in reality, it is yet another level of control. If you are not in the system, your product will not be sold. Added to this is a system of carbon quotas. Farmers are required to report not only on their harvest, but also on emissions, energy consumption, and climate impact. Based on this data, they gain or lose access to the market. The data is collected by digital sensors, drones, and blockchain. This creates a new form of dependency: digital agricultural bureaucracy. At the same time, the trend towards synthetic food is growing. Meatless cutlets, animal-free dairy products, and seafood made from mushrooms are already being produced. All this is presented as caring for the planet. But critics point out that all the components of such products are centrally produced, patented, and therefore controlled. A substitution is taking place. Food is becoming technology. But humans are not algorithms. The body needs complex, multifaceted, living foods. They cannot be replaced by sterile powder with additives. However, this is exactly what future megacorporations are offering. Food as a service. Subscription, access code, nutrition algorithm. At the government level, there is discussion of a transition to a global food identification system. Its essence is to assign each product a unique digital code that will be linked to a system of permits, quotas, and logistics. In the future, there are plans to introduce personal food passports, which will indicate what a person is allowed to consume based on their age, genome, health status, and possibly social rating. This is no longer control over farmers. This is control over consumers. The scenario could look like this. You go to a shop and are refused milk because you have exceeded your carbon footprint limit, or your personal food profile does not allow this product. Such systems are already being tested in some countries as part of sustainable development programs. This is where the logic of the Montanto Project leads. Not just to control over what grows in the field, but to control over what ends up on your plate. This is the final frontier. After that, people lose their connection to the land, to biology, to nature. They become participants in a food interface. But there are alternatives. Movements for an agricultural renaissance are emerging around the world. The preservation of old varieties, the revival of seed exchange, and farmers' cooperatives. People are creating their own seed banks, disconnected from global systems. This is a form of resistance, a form of return to the roots. Some scientists are developing open genetic platforms where the DNA of agricultural crops will be available to everyone without patents. Others are creating crypto-protected seed exchange networks based on trust and decentralization. It is becoming clear that the fight for food is a fight for freedom. Not because something threatens us tomorrow, but because today, thousands of people around the world are losing the right to choose what to eat, how to plant, and how to feed their children. If grain has become code, we must reclaim the right to write that code ourselves. Not corporations, not bureaucrats, not algorithms, but us as part of nature. This is how the story of Project Montanto ends. But another story begins about how humanity can reclaim its seeds, its land, and its freedom. This is not just a fight for the harvest. It is a fight for the future,